There was no crime. The crime is against me. This has to do with election interference, plain and simple.
We've got 45 days here to do our work, and someone wants to continue to string this out.
It is going to be difficult for my Republican friends to keep calling President Biden feeble while he continues to take Speaker McCarthy's lunch money in every negotiation.
LaFonza Butler has spent her career fighting for the rights of women and working people. She's herself succeeding a trailblazer by breaking more barriers.
Hello, I'm Weijia Jiang in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Former President Donald Trump attended the start of his civil fraud trial in New York City today. The former president, the Trump Organization, multiple executives, and 2 of his children are accused of committing widespread fraud. New York Attorney General Letitia James is seeking $250 million and multiple sanctions, which would limit their ability to do business in the state. The former president had this to say at the courthouse about the case.
Hey, it's a terrible, terrible thing. This was for politics. Now, it has been very successful for them because they took me off the campaign trail. Because I've been sitting in a courthouse all day long instead of being in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, or a lot of other places I could be at. This is a horrible situation for our country. It's never happened before.
For more on this, Finn Gomez and Robert Costa joins us now. Finn is CBS News' political director, and Robert is CBS News' chief election and campaign correspondent. Robert, I want to begin with you since you've been there all day. Take us inside and first catch us up on what happened in court today.
Weijia, so good to be with you and Finn. Inside the courtroom today, I sat just steps behind former President Donald Trump, and when he entered that courtroom, the tension in the room was apparent. He walked right past the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, did not look at her at all, just went straight to his seat with his legal team. He was also joined by his political advisors like Jason Miller and Stephen Chung, underscoring that he's in a legal battle and a political battle at this moment. And he sat through all of these presentations by the prosecutors in this civil case, the government bringing their arguments about how, in their view, he committed fraud year after year in terms of his valuation. I saw him shake his head, put his arms across his chest, and he lashed out about the proceedings to reporters in the hallway during the break moments.
And Robert, I'm so glad you brought up the political impact of this because, Finn, Trump didn't have to even show up today in court. It's not typical that we hear from a defendant during the trial. Why do you think, it was important for him to do that? What's he trying to get out of this?
Well, Weijia, as you know from covering him in the White House for multiple years, this may not be typical for your typical defendant, but this is very typical for Donald Trump. He's leaning into the political argument that he's trying to make, that this is taking him off the campaign trail. This is his version of election interference into his own campaign this time around. He's trying to change the narrative, make it more beneficial to himself and to his campaign, but also to try to rally his troops, rally his base voters to say, look at what they're doing to me. This is clearly, with what he's saying and speaking multiple times to press, it is about politics.
And everything he said was a page from a pretty classic Trump handbook about how this is a political witch hunt. But here's what New York Attorney General Letitia James has to say about the timing, which, of course, Trump and his allies are questioning because they say if this wasn't political, she would have brought these charges on way sooner. Let's take a listen.
My message is simple. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how much money you think you may have, no one is above the law. And it is my responsibility and my duty and my job to enforce it.
Robert, how is the Trump team trying to dismantle James's argument about why she's bringing forth these charges? And how is this playing out in the campaign, especially as we look at the Republican candidates and as they're trying to get Trump out of the way?
It's not really having an impact, at least so far, based on my reporting and conversations with Trump's rival campaigns, because they see in all of this litigation and all of these legal challenges a potential political risk for them if they go after Trump on these fronts. They don't want to alienate him and his voters should they need them down the line, so there's a bit of a hands-off approach politically. Legally, this is a different kind of situation for Trump and his lawyers than we have with the federal cases on classified records and on January 6th. In this particular instance, it's a civil lawsuit. So a lot of money's on the line. Trump's being sued for $250 million by the state of New York. At the same time, the future of his businesses, a business that is so central to his public persona, his family, is now at risk because the government is saying here in their argument that everything the Trump organization has done in terms of valuation, in terms of how it secures loans, in terms of how Trump comes up with his own net worth, that's fraudulent. And if a business has been operating under the pretenses of fraud for years, then it shouldn't be able to operate anymore in the state of New York. So for Trump, win or lose the nomination or the presidency in 2024, the Trump organization, I used to go up to see him at the 26th floor of Trump Tower to interview him years ago, a decade ago. This is someone who has the company so intertwined with his politics and his life. That's why he showed up voluntarily today, I'm told by his associates. He wanted to be here defensively to defend what he has done and his own company.
And it's an important distinction, Robert, that you make, that this is a civil fraud trial. Of course, he also faces criminal charges that the DOJ has brought against him. On 60 Minutes, the Attorney General was asked what he would do if President Biden asked him to take action on the Trump investigations. And here's what he had to say. Let's listen.
I am sure that that will not happen, but I would not do anything in that regard. And if necessary, I would resign. But there is no sense that anything like that will happen.
Have you ever had to tell him hands off these investigations, Mr. President?
No, because he has never tried to put hands on these investigations.
So, Finn, we just heard from Garland. We hear often from President Biden that he is completely separate from whatever the DOJ does. Do you think that's enough? Does the public believe that these Trump investigations have nothing to do with the 2024 presidential race?
I think half the public probably believes that. I think if you look at the Republican side of the field, if you will, they probably believe an alternate narrative, and that is the one that I think you're hearing from Trump and the Trump campaign, which is this is done for a political calculus. There's a political motivation for this, but as you've seen the Attorney General, they're trying to draw a line and be frank and show that contrast. And I think there's also a contrast between this administration, what they're trying to showcase, and what they think is the big difference between this administration and the previous one, the Trump administration, where where there was the allegations of that influence, the allegations that push to have the Attorney General. If you recall, Bill Barr's the push on Bill Barr by the former president to do some of these similar type of investigations. So I think the Biden administration is trying to really denote that line.
And Robert, with so many Trump investigations, should the public get used to seeing what we saw today? Trump sitting in a courtroom, preparing to make remarks every chance he gets, because this is going to be a long road ahead with so many indictments he faces.
It's part of a pattern we've seen from former President Trump. He likes to show up at times. Sometimes he's required to by law if he's indicted and there's an arraignment. But in this case, it was voluntary, but he showed up. When you think back to Trump's history in New York, I mean, this is someone who has always lived a public life. He has lived a life where he wants to make sure he's out there, whether it's in Page 6 in the tabloids or talking to reporters or on the campaign trail. He's doing it his way and having himself define his own public role, not his own age. I mean, think about Corey Lewandowski and so many people who've worked for Trump campaigns over the years. They say it's Trump himself who wants to be out front. That's where he was again today.
Okay, Robert, Costa, thank you so much. Finn Gomez, always great to see you both. Appreciate it. Kevin McCarthy worked with Democrats to prevent a government shutdown. Could that move end up costing him the Speaker's gavel? We'll talk about it next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Even though the short-term spending bill didn't include Ukraine aid, President Biden seemed to imply that a deal was made with Speaker McCarthy to pass future funding. This afternoon, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre didn't exactly offer any clarity when she was asked questions about it. Here was some of her exchange with CBS News Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes.
When I asked the president about the prospect of future deals with Speaker McCarthy, he said, we just made one about Ukraine. But it sounds like you're saying they didn't just make one about Ukraine.
What I'm saying is that we know that there's bipartisan support, right, for Ukraine funding.
Well, why would the president say that he made a deal if he didn't?
I'm just saying that what we're seeing currently from Congress is that there has been, right? There has been overwhelming support. That is what the president said. A majority of Congress showing overwhelming support.
Is it possible the president made a deal that you don't know about?
I'm just saying that I'm not going to go beyond what the president said.
CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins us now. Scott, we have a lot to get to, but let's start there with this apparent Ukraine deal that President Biden may have struck with House Speaker McCarthy. Do you know if a deal was made?
So we asked Speaker McCarthy that very question several times today, and he says no, there was no agreement to bring up Ukraine aid at a later date and guarantee its passage in return for what happened this past weekend, the deal to keep the government open. But you're going to see some of McCarthy's critics capitalize on either the lack of clarity over this or any allusion to a deal, because they've been coming for his job, and they are likely to do so again this week, saying he has cut deals that are unacceptable with the White House. They said as much after the debt ceiling crisis was ended with a cooperation agreement between McCarthy and President Biden in May. And they've said it again this weekend when they think he cut too sweetheart a deal to keep the government open without exacting the concessions they wanted, border security legislation and significant cuts to federal programs. This is going to fuel a fire that's already burning here at the Capitol.
And one of his loudest critics, Congressman Matt Gaetz, who is trying to oust the speaker, spoke on the House floor today. Let's take a listen to what some of he had to say about McCarthy.
It is becoming increasingly clear who the Speaker of the House already works for, and it's not the Republican conference.
So how is McCarthy responding to that? And just bring us up to speed about how realistic it is that Gaetz will actually succeed in getting rid of McCarthy.
I think ultimately, Gaetz is seizing on whatever he can seize on to continue to amplify himself and amplify this argument that he believes McCarthy has to go. Now, obviously, Democrats would hold some cards in this case they don't typically hold, that they may be able to vote in a way synchronized with these defecting Republicans to jeopardize Kevin McCarthy's speakership. Right now, they're keeping their powder dry. They haven't said whether they're going to plow ahead and join Gaetz's effort or stand back and do some other alternative to preserve Kevin McCarthy. We do know this, though. Without equivocation, McCarthy is making clear he thinks he's going to stand up and knock down any of these challenges. And in the meantime, it serves as a distraction during a busy legislative week, and it seeks to add acrimony to an already charged situation where members of Congress have 45 days to cut a deal they couldn't cut before this past weekend on the bigger spending issues. And acrimony is the last thing they need when it's deal-making time.
But it's hard to imagine that they won't have a healthy dose of it in the next 45 days. And Scott, just tell us what has to happen between now and then in order for the government to remain open, because they still have a lot they want to get done. And it's hard to imagine what's going to change between now and then to bridge this gap.
Well, there's a whole grocery list of wedge issues that need to be rectified, not one or two, but a whole bunch. But potentially the biggest one is what to do with the Ukraine funding in general. There are obviously some number of House Republicans who have a hesitation, if not a rejection, toward approving more Ukraine money. That's why it was stripped from the deal this weekend. But there's a bipartisan group that says it has to be done and has to be done before November. Take a listen to one of them, Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger from Virginia.
We have to make sure that we are clearly outlining what we will make available to them in the future and continuing with the support that we give them as they are fighting for their own country, for their freedom. Once Ukraine was invaded, the United States played an extraordinary role in leading efforts initially to sanction Russia and also to provide the extraordinary and very necessary aid to Ukraine that not only has the United States provided, but our partners throughout the world. And so the risk that exists the longer we wait is that we might allow for some amount of doubt.
That's why some of this could just be intractable, because you've got Republicans and Democrats split on something as big and pressing as Ukraine funding. Forget the other things that are tying them up. All of this has to get rectified in a month and a half in a Congress that seems jammed up on so much.
I'm glad you brought us back to Ukraine, Scott, because I got this sense from McCarthy that he was trying to attach funding for border security to any new aid for Ukraine, which I don't believe was on the table before. Is that true?
At a minimum, it's a rhetorical argument that he's trying to make, that the Democrats and perhaps the White House are too fixated on Ukrainian security and not enough on American security. It certainly serves the purposes of him trying to get his border security measures passed. Some of the border security measures are just non-starters with Democrats, the White House, and the Senate, including infusing billions more taxpayer dollars into the border wall. But this Ukrainian issue is going to surface before the next deadline. There's been some emphasis put by Democrats and some Senate Republicans that money is needed yesterday, much less by November 15th or November 17th. I expect that to command a lot of the bandwidth in Congress as this week begins.
And Scott, as if there wasn't enough drama in those halls already, I want to ask you about Congressman Jamal Bowman, who pulled a fire alarm, he says, to escape the room, to get out physically. Can you bring us up to speed about whether he's going to face consequences for that and what that might look like if he does?
CBS News can confirm there's both a House Administration Committee and a U.S. Capitol Police investigation underway into what happened Saturday in the Cannon House office building across the street. Republicans are accusing Bowman of deliberately pulling that fire alarm to delay what was some pretty tense and hectic proceedings on that continuing resolution. Bowman has apologized, said he did it mistakenly trying to get through a door as he rushed to votes, but we'll see where the investigation leads. He, by the way, is a former middle school principal.
All right, Scott McFarland, thank you for all of your reporting, as always. California Governor Gavin Newsom is choosing LaFonza Butler to fill the late Dianne Feinstein's vacant Senate seat. We'll break that down next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. California Governor Gavin Newsom has selected Emily's List President LaFonza Butler to fill the seat of the late Senator Dianne Feinstein. Butler has been the president of the organization dedicated to electing women since 2021. Once sworn in, she'll be the only Black woman currently serving in the U.S. Senate and the first openly LGBTQ+ person to represent California in the upper chamber. Joel Payne and Maura Gillespie join us now. Joel is a CBS News political contributor and the chief communications officer for Move On. And Maura is the founder of Blue Stack Strategies and the former advisor to Speaker John Boehner and former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger. Joel, I want to start with you, but first let's take a listen to why Governor Newsom says he chose Butler.
Everything that she's been advocating for in the last few years meet this moment as it relates to rights regressions, issues of civil rights and issues of LGBTQ rights, women and girls, issues related to voting rights. She's been on the front end of all of these things.
So when you heard his choice, were you surprised or did this make sense?
I think certainly this was a welcome surprise by many folks within the kind of Democratic progressive ecosystem. Ms. Butler is very well respected. As you mentioned, she's the president of Emily's List. She's a former close advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris. And she's a really experienced political organizer in the state of California. She's a known entity. She does kind of check the boxes that Governor Newsom wanted to with finding an African-American woman, a woman of color. Also, without dipping his toe or kind of putting his thumb on the scale in the ongoing Senate primary where you have Barbara Lee, Adam Schiff, Katie Porter all competing. So this kind of allows him to do all those things at once. And I can tell you that one other thing that's really important to consider here is that this is a person who is very well regarded on the issue of abortion, obviously representing a group like Emily's List. So elevating that issue nationally is also something that checks a box for Governor Newsom as well.
And Maura, I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to ask you about that issue of abortion. If you think this, speaks to what Democrats might be trying to do to really try to showcase that for 2024, and if you think it will be as big of an issue as it was in the midterms when we saw it really did play a role in voters' choices.
It's going to continue to be an issue. Obviously, I think the economy and then safety and security are going to be the number 1 and 2 issues that voters are going to be focused on. But right behind it is going to be abortion. And the Republican Party has long had problems in really expressing a standpoint that can get them through a general election. And we've seen that obviously in the midterms most recently, but there are a lot of people in the party that maybe aren't super outspoken about it, but care deeply about this issue. And the super restrictive stances that most Republicans take is not going to get them there and is not going to be in line with what the Republican Party is. As a country, as society, we are moving beyond the super restrictive stances. And I think I've long held this view about being conservative. To me, a conservative is a smaller, more accountable government. And nothing says big government like telling half the population they don't get to have medical freedom. And so I think Republicans can message this differently and really focus on the broader conversation of childcare, of other issues for women's health. So yes, I definitely think that Governor Newsom is obviously trying to hone in on this and by highlighting it in this way. But Republicans will have to push back on that for sure.
But Joel, Butler doesn't live in California right now. She lives not far from here in Maryland. And I know that she's received some criticism for that. Is that going to be a hindrance as she, starts to serve the state of California?
Not for me. She's a fellow Marylander.
Well.
I am too. No, I'm just teasing. Look, I'm certain that's an unfortunate quirk of this, although I will say because she has such a deep, well-respected history in the state. This is somebody who I think led the fight for $15 minimum wage in the state of California. She's a very well-known entity. I don't get the sense there will be any blowback locally, and I think nationally most Democrats feel really good about the decision that Governor Newsom made there.
Republicans are going to hit on it, and we both know that. We all know that Republicans are going to continue. You're seeing it all over X or Twitter. It's all over right now, them talking about that she's from Maryland. Maryland's got their 3rd senator. Congratulations. And so I think that question is going to continue to come up is this a position to make history with this nomination, or are you trying to put the best person in the position to do the job? And Governor Newsom is going to be asked that question, I think, time and time again.
I'd point out also, you got Mitt Romney, who represents Utah, who was the governor of Massachusetts before. You've had Hillary Clinton represent New York in the Senate very well from Illinois. So it's not uncommon to have these types of cross-state representations.
Point taken. It's not new or unprecedented. I want to turn to the 2024 presidential election because recently President Biden said he did not support a no-labels candidate, and I want to quickly listen to what he had to say.
Your former Senate colleague, Joe Lieberman, says he is upholding democracy by working with an organization called No Labels to pursue a potential third-party candidacy. Is he?
Well, he has a democratic right to do it. There's no reason not to do that. Now, it's going to help the other guy, and he knows. So that's a political decision he's making that I obviously think is a mistake.
So aside from how realistic it is, I mean, I want to ask you if you think it's too late. Is it too late to see a third-party candidate, or is it a possibility at this point?
Well, I think it's certainly a possibility. And look, as the president said, there's nothing to stop No Labels from getting on the ballot. I represent Move On. Move On is very opposed to the No Labels bid, just for full disclosure. I think I would point out is, the president talked about Joe Lieberman there. You can go back 20 years to Joe Lieberman, who was on the Gore-Lieberman ticket, where Ralph Nader swung the election to George W. Bush. And I'm sure you're going to hear a lot of Democrats reminding Joe Lieberman and his supporters at No Labels of that.
And Maura, do you agree with the president that it could help the GOP?
It's interesting because you have the No Labels talking about a third party, but then you also now have RFK Jr. also exploring a third party option. So what does that create? And I think it could be damaging to both sides, truly. And we don't know where we're going to be at 2024. We don't necessarily even know our candidates. Yes, President Biden has said he's running, but some people think that Governor Newsom is actually setting himself up to run, and that President Biden will step down and say that he's not actually running for re-election. So there's a lot that could still be uncovered as we get through. So a third party, I mean, it could have its own primary issue between RFK Jr. and the No Labels nominee. So
well, we do know that we will see you guys both back here because there's a lot to talk about. So Maura Gillespie and Joel Payne, thank you so much. That does it for today, but you can stream America Decides Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.